History often leaves its most haunting figures unnamed. In 1485, as Europe reeled from famine, plague, and the quiet intrigues of collapsing courts, one boy slipped into the record with barely a trace, a servant no more than 15, who held the king's cup on the night a dynasty ended. His name is lost, erased perhaps by design, but one chilling phrase survives in the royal archives: the silent one who poured. He was a cupbearer, a role both sacred and perilous. To serve the king's drink was to hold his life in your hands. The ritual of pouring, of tasting, of presenting the vessel was bound up in trust. In this boy's silence, courtiers claimed, the king found security. No whispered plots could pass his lips. No secrets could be betrayed in speech. Yet silence is not always innocence. When the king's body collapsed in convulsions, some said it was poison, the bitter aftertaste of a carefully prepared death. Others claimed the boy had smiled faintly, as if savoring a moment only he could understand. He never spoke in his own defense. He never explained the last look in his eyes. And then, like spilled wine soaking into stone, he vanished from history. But folklore, that strange echo chamber of memory, kept him alive. In taverns and sermons, in letters smuggled between nobles, the story changed shape. Some told of a mute angel of death, sent to close a chapter of rule already rotting from within. Others whispered he was merely a pawn, used, discarded, then cursed by the very silence that once protected him. Here lies the puzzle. Was he victim, executioner, or something far stranger? Modern historians dissect the evidence, weighing accounts of sudden illness against the possibility of arsenic or nightshade hidden in the chalice. Psychologists ask, what does power mean to one who cannot speak? Does silence breed obedience, or conceal rebellion? And theology paints him in darker colors still, a vessel not only of drink but of destiny, his mute service transformed into ritual sacrifice. The court never recorded his fate. Some claim he was executed in secret. Others believe he escaped, living as a nameless wanderer whose shadow trailed across Europe. The absence of certainty feeds the knees. If history cannot tell us what happened, folklore will, and folklore is never kind. Tonight we descend into this riddle of silence and service. Through fragments of record, superstition, and psychological speculation, we chase the outline of the boy who never spoke, but who ended a reign. His story is not simply about death or betrayal. It is about the fragility of trust, the weaponization of ritual, and the unnerving possibility that sometimes the smallest, quietest figure at the table can alter the course of history. Perhaps he was guilty. Perhaps he was innocent. Perhaps truth itself drowned in that final drink. What remains is a haunting. The silent cupbearer, the servant who gave a king his last sip, and with it, gave a kingdom its last breath. History remembers him only in fragments, as though his existence was too fragile or too dangerous to fully record. In the brittle pages of a 15th-century European court archive, his name never appears in full. Instead, he's referred to only once in the margins as the silent one who poured. No lineage, no heraldry, no family tree, just silence. To some historians, this proves he was unimportant, another nameless servant lost to time. To others, the absence itself suggests a darker possibility, that his silence was not only physical but symbolic, a secret the kingdom itself tried to bury. Even in those earliest references, he emerges less like a boy and more like an omen, slipping into history without explanation, as though conjured into being by forces unseen. The lack of record raises an unsettling question. Was he merely a victim of circumstance, or was his very presence curated by design? One theory, preserved in a monk's chronicle from 1482, claims he was a war orphan. According to this account, raiders burned through villages on the northern frontier, leaving behind smoldering ruins and corpses. Among the wreckage, a child was found, mute, frail, and wide-eyed. He was delivered into the care of a monastery where silence was not seen as a handicap, but a discipline. Within those cloisters, the boy grew accustomed to a world without words, communicating instead through gesture, gaze, and presence. The monks recorded him with awe, one writing that, "The vessel has no tongue, yet his eyes pour like wine." While other orphans wailed and struggled against their fates, this one watched with eerie composure. To some, this calmness suggested serenity. To others, it was unnerving, the mark of a child too old for his years. In time, nobles seeking servants came to the monastery. Silence was valued in courts where secrets traveled faster than armies. A child who could never speak, never betray, never confess. Such a child was not a burden but a prize. Some accounts say he was sold. Others say he was gifted. Either way, his journey from cloister to court was inevitable. If this account is true, his muteness was not a flaw but his currency, the very trait that earned him passage into the royal household. Yet another document, a palace guard's ledger from 2 years later, paints a different picture. It records the arrival of a boy at the southern gate, unaccompanied, nameless, holding nothing but a carved wooden cup. He was accepted without question, as though expected. To the guards, he was an orphan seeking work. To the courtiers who later whispered about him, he seemed more apparition than child, placed at the threshold of power like an offering. His arrival sparked fascination and unease. The boy bowed too perfectly for his age, some said, as though his servitude had been rehearsed long before he entered the palace. Others claimed his insolence gave him the appearance of wisdom, as though he observed truths the rest of the court missed. Servants avoided his gaze, saying it lingered too long, weighed too heavily, as if he could see through their masks. Even the queen's ladies whispered of him, wondering aloud whether his presence was blessing or curse. Folklore, Asselways, embroidered what history left unfinished. Villagers told stories of a child born beneath a blood moon, his tongue cut at birth to silence a prophecy too terrible to be heard. Others believed God had closed his mouth as punishment, sealing him in silence to prevent blasphemy. In darker whispers, he was said to have been marked by the devil himself, his tongue offered as tithe in exchange for power yet to come. One particularly chilling tale insists that as an infant, when he cried, no sound emerged, yet the windows of the house rattled and the candles flickered, as though the air itself refused his voice. Whether these stories were born of fear, fascination, or truth hardly matters. What they reveal is the same. A mute child could not be considered ordinary. To a superstitious age, his silence was not absence but destiny. Historians, of course, try to ground these tales in realism. They argue that silence was nothing mystical, merely the product of birth defect, illness, or injury. In a time of constant famine and disease, such conditions were common. More cynical scholars suggest mutilation, that his tongue was cut, either in punishment or ritual. To them, he was no more than another victim of a brutal society that treated children as currency. They note that many courts employed boys as cupbearers, pages, or food tasters, often chosen from among the expendable. What better servant than one who could never speak of what a saw, who could never reveal the king's secrets under torture or bribe? Theologians counter with an entirely different lens. In Scripture, silence is never neutral. Prophets fall mute before visions, angels descend in wordless awe, and demons twist tongues into silence to prevent confession. To a religious mind, the boy's muteness was not accident but sign. He was either a vessel for divine purpose or a channel for infernal will. To dismiss him as merely disabled is, they argue, to miss the deeper truth. Every silence is pregnant with meaning. His was assilence that shaped destiny. This clash between historian and theologian frames the boy's earliest years. Was he a pawn of society, sold into service because of a flaw? Or was he chosen, by fate, by God, or by something darker? Each interpretation adds weight to his presence, transforming him from mute servant into an omen. It was not simply in the court. He haunted it. What makes his story even more disturbing is how his silence transformed into power. In a court where whispers decided wars and rumors toppled dynasties, words were weapons sharper than swords. But the mute boy carried a different weapon: absence. When he poured the king's wine, no reassurance passed his lips. When he bowed, no flattery followed. His silence created a void, and in that void, others projected their fears, their suspicions, their hopes. To some, his muteness made him trustworthy, incapable of betrayal. To others, it made him dangerous, for a servant who never spoke could never be understood. Over time, that absence of voice became presence of myth. Silence was no longer lack but excess, too much meaning, too much possibility, too much danger. His earliest years may have been marked by trauma, abandonment, or ritual, but what remained was the same: a boy who stood in the center of power, who spoke no words, and who made everyone else speak around him. The origins of the cupbearer remain unsolved, scattered across rumor, record, and folklore. Was he a war orphan molded by monks into a vessel of discipline? Was he an abandoned child, drifting mysteriously to the palace gates with a cup in hand? Was he a chosen one, silenced at birth to hold prophecy in his chest? The answers fracture into contradictions, and yet all point toward the same unsettling truth. His silence was never meaningless. It was his identity, his currency, his shadow, and his weapon. Whether by fate or cruelty, the boy entered the court not as a servant but as an omen. And from this beginning, the story only darkens. for a mute child with a cup in hand would one day pour the drink that ended a dynasty. It was the spring of 1485, when the court gathered for what would later be remembered not as a celebration, but as an omen. The palace, once radiant with banners and echoing with music, now seemed a place of shadows. Famine stalked the countryside. Crops rotted in fields, livestock dwindled, and beggars pressed against the palace gates. Inside the walls, however, the nobility prepared for a banquet, determined to hold on to ceremony even as their world collapsed around them. And at the heart of it all sat the king, gray-faced, weary, yet still draped in velvet and gold, his crown tilted slightly as if even his head could no longer bear its weight. Around him flickered candlelight, gilding the room with illusions of warmth. In the corners, musicians played hollow notes that did little to disguise the tension rising like smoke. Servants hurried with trays of meat and spiced bread, but all eyes lingered not on the food, nor even the king, but on the boy who held the cup. The mute cupbearer entered with the silence of ritual. His steps made no sound upon the stone floor, his gaze fixed downward yet radiating a gravity that pulled every glance toward him. He carried the goblet with both hands, as though it were not a vessel of silver but something heavier, an offering, a curse, a weight. Witnesses later described the scene with chilling detail. The boy's hands steady as marble, the liquid inside reflecting candlelight like blood. The king raised his head slowly, eyes watery, lips cracked, and for the briefest moment he seemed to hesitate. Perhaps it was the cough rattling in his chest. Perhaps it was the unease that had settled over the hall. Or perhaps he too felt the weight of what was about to happen. He took the cup, he drank. Silence followed, not the usual pause of respect, but a silence thick enough to feel. A chronicler wrote that even the fire seemed to falter in its crackling, as if the world itself held its breath. Then came the king's labored exhale, a sound halfway between relief and dread. He leaned back in his chair, face pale, his eyes searching the room as though to confirm the loyalty of those who watched him. Moments later, his hand slipped, the goblet clattering against the floor with a note that echoed far longer than it should have. The king convulsed, seized, and within moments his crown slid from his head to the table beside him. The feast had turned funeral. What killed him remains contested to this day. In the centuries since, soil beneath the palace kitchens has been tested by archaeologists and chemists. Some reported faint traces of arsenic, leading modern historians to suspect deliberate poisoning. Arsenic, after all, was not uncommon in the arsenals of the ambitious. It was tasteless, odorless, and slipped easily into wine. Mineralers had fallen to it before, and yet if the king was poisoned, why had suspicion fallen not on courtiers or rivals, but on the mute child who carried the goblet? Political enemies thrived in that palace. Factions plotted daily. Yet folklore insists the boy alone was the instrument of death. Those who favor science argued the explanation is obvious. The boy was a servant, not a conspirator. Someone else prepared the wine. He merely delivered it. If poison lurked in the cup, it was not his doing but the work of scheming nobles. Still, the superstition of the time and perhaps the hunger for scapegoats clung to him. It was easier to place blame on the mute servant than to unravel the knots of betrayal woven through the court. To name him guilty was to make the mystery simple, the fear containable. But folklore does not thrive on simplicity. Instead, it took the boy's silence and transformed it into something far darker. The peasants whispered that no powder, no herb, no poison had passed his hands. They said the poison was his silence itself, that when he poured the wine, he poured into it the weight of unspoken words, binding death to liquid. The king, by drinking, consumed not just wine but silence, and silence claimed his life. These stories multiplied, that the boy had smiled as the goblet touched the king's lips, though he had never smiled before. That shadows clung to him in the candlelight, curling like smoke around his hands. That when the goblet fell, it did not ring against stone but gave off a hollow, inhuman tone. As if struck from bone rather than silver. Theologians of the time seized on the moment as proof of divine judgment. They declared the mute cupbearer a curse sent by heaven, a punishment for the sins of the kingdom. The famine, the unrest, the failing king, all were signs of rot. To them, the boy was not a servant but an angel of silence, his presence a reminder that God could choose the voiceless to deliver wrath. Priests preached sermons on the danger of hubris, warning that silence could be more damning than blasphemy. One friar went so far as to claim the boy had been born for this sole act, that his entire existence was a vessel into which God had poured his vengeance. Psychologists, writing centuries later, interpret the scene differently. To them, the court was a place of symbols as much as reality. A mute servant offering a final drink was not merely action but ritual, a symbol heavy with meaning. Silence became prophecy. In such a charged environment, perception mattered more than truth. The boy's mute hands carried not only the goblet, but also the weight of all the court's fears. His presence at that moment turned coincidence into inevitability. Whether the king died from illness, poison, or exhaustion, the sight of the mute cupbearer became the lens through which the event was remembered. The king's death became not medical, not political, but symbolic. Others insist there was nothing symbolic at all, that it was murder cloaked in superstition. Ambitious nobles needed a scapegoat, and who better than the mute boy? He had no voice to defend himself, no family to rally on his behalf, no allies in the court. He was already half ghost in their eyes, and so by attaching blame to him, the true killers hid their tracks. Conspiracies flourish in this interpretation, that the queen's faction had him framed, or that foreign envoys sought to destabilize the kingdom, or that the boy himself was placed in the court precisely to take the fall when the inevitable happened. Yet none of these theories fully explain the uncanny details that surface in every account. Witnesses all mention the silence that swallowed the hall. They note the boy's calm hands, the faintest curve of his lips, the strange weight of the moment. How much of this is memory twisted by fear and how much is real? Historians struggle to parse it. Folklore has no such burden. Folklore insists silence itself killed the king. Legends grew quickly after the feast. Some claimed that in the days following, servants saw the boy standing alone in the banquet hall at night, pouring invisible wine into invisible cups. Others swore that when the king was entombed, his goblet was placed at his side, yet it was found empty no matter how much wine was poured in. The people began to call him the silent cupbearer, a name that erased his boyhood entirely and made him a figure of myth. He was no longer child or servant, but omen, curse, executioner. The banquet that should have been a symbol of continuity became instead the dynasty's death rattle. With the king gone, factions tore at the kingdom, each claiming legitimacy. Some nobles fled, others schemed. Priests thundered from pulpits, and in the middle of it all, the memory of the mute servant lingered like a ghost. He was not seen again in the records. Some claim he was executed that very night, burned as a witch's familiar. Others claim he fled, slipping away into the forest, never to be found. A darker legend insists he remained within the palace walls, his silence haunting the corridors long after the dynasty fell. Whether victim, pawn, or executioner, the cupbearer's role at the king's final feast cemented his place in history. Science offers the arsenic theory, clean and reasonable. Theology offers divine judgment, wrath poured into a goblet. Psychology offers ritual and symbol, the weight of silence. Folklore offers curses, shadows, and omens. None can be disproven entirely, and none can satisfy completely. What remains is the image, etched across time, of a mute boy holding a cup, his silence heavier than words, his hands steadier than fate itself. The king drank and an age ended. The question is not simply what killed the king, but what the boy's silence meant. Was it innocence? The muteness of a child caught in a deadly game? Or was it inevitability, a silence cultivated from birth to serve as the final word of a kingdom? The truth lies somewhere between history and myth, between science and superstition, and in that space of uncertainty the dread endures. For long after the feast was forgotten, long after the palace crumbled, long after the dynasty dissolved, the story of the silent cupbearer survived. And in every telling, his silence is not weakness. It is power. It is poison. It is prophecy poured into Akup. In the centuries that followed the death of the king, the search for explanations became as relentless as the hunger that had once hollowed out his kingdom. No historian, no priest, no physician could rest comfortably with the image of a silent boy standing at the monarch's side, holding the goblet that carried both sustenance and doom. Was it a simple case of poisoning, a crime of opportunity disguised in ceremony, or something darker, something that eludes the neat categories of rational thought? To understand how the legend grew, one must journey through two lenses: the cold light of science and the shadowed corridors of superstition. Both offer clarity, yet both dissolve before reaching certainty, leaving only the silence of the cupbearer at the center of an unsolved mystery. Archaeology began the first serious attempt to strip the story of myth. Excavations beneath the ruins of the royal kitchens in the early 20th century revealed charred hearthstones, shattered pottery, and beneath them, soil laced with mineral traces. Among them was arsenic, known since antiquity as a poison that could mimic natural illness while leaving little visible trace in the body. Some argued this was the smoking gun, proof that the king's final feast was tainted not by curse but by chemistry. Arsenic poisoning fits the reported symptoms: the labored breathing, the sudden collapse, the discoloration of the skin. To skeptics, the mystery was solved. The silent boy was nothing more than an accessory to circumstance, remembered not for guilt but for silence that made him the perfect scapegoat. But history rarely bows so easily to certainty, for arsenic traces in soil can linger for centuries, migrating through water tables and mineral veins. The very kitchens built atop stone quarried from poisoned earth could, centuries later, still yield traces that prove nothing of intent. Was it deliberate contamination, or simply the residue of medieval living? When arsenic found use in dyes, candles, even medicines, the evidence seemed damning, yet like a phantom it slipped away under closer inspection. The soil spoke, but in riddles. Still, physicians and toxicologists built upon the archaeological findings, offering new theories. Some argued the king's death was not the work of assassins or mute servants, but of the land itself. Heavy metal poisoning from wells, laden with lead, mercury, and arsenic, could explain not just his sudden death but years of reported decline, hallucinations, paranoia, and failing health. One physician noted that royal archives contained curious references to the king's visions, phantoms in corridors, voices at night, even the claim that shadows moved independently of their owners. To modern eyes, these are textbook symptoms of neurological poisoning. Perhaps the boy, silent and observant, was nothing more than the final witness to a tragedy already written in water. Yet if science promised resolution, folklore refused to surrender. In the villages surrounding the ruined court, tales persisted that no natural element could explain what occurred. They spoke of the hush that fell over the hall as the cup was raised, how even the dogs outside ceased their barking, how the torches dimmed though no wind stirred. The boy's silence, they said, poured into the wine like shadow, binding death itself to the cup. He needed no powders or poisons, no conspiracies of apothecaries or scheming nobles. His silence was his weapon, his ritual. Chroniclers of the time described that silence with unnerving detail. "No bird sang, no man spoke, and yet the boy smiled," wrote one scribe, his account later condemned as heretical. Others swore that in the moments before the king's fall, the boy's eyes darkened, not with malice but with inevitability, as though he carried out a task far older than himself. To believers, these were not embellishments. They were signs of a ritual inherited from an age when silence was sacred, when to withhold words was to channel forces beyond human comprehension. Theologians of the era fed this interpretation. Silence, they argued, could be more powerful than speech. The boy's muteness was framed as divine, either a curse imposed at birth to contain prophecy, or a blessing to keep him from revealing truths men were not meant to hear. The church was divided. Some called him a vessel of God, others a pawn of the devil. His act at the feast was framed not as murder, but as judgment. The king had sinned, the land had starved, and through the silent cupbearer, heaven or hell had delivered its sentence. Psychology centuries later added another layer. Modern scholars of ritual behavior suggest that in highly ceremonial courts, symbolism carried weight equal to or greater than action. A mute servant pouring a final drink into the hands of a dying king was itself prophecy fulfilled. The king's failing body, already weakened by famine and disease, may have surrendered not to toxins, but to suggestion, to the belief that this final act, offered in silence, carried inevitable doom. The boy's muteness, his very absence of words, became a mirror into which the king projected his own fears. In this reading, the boy killed not with poison but with presence, weaponized by the rituals of power. But psychology cannot escape its own limitations. For if the death was symbolic, then why the soil laced with arsenic? If it was poison, why the silence that haunted the witnesses more than the convulsions of the king? Each theory explains part of the story, yet none explains it whole. The boy's silence resists every attempt to pin it down. It remains like the blank space in a manuscript, a void into which meaning pours but never settles. Superstition clung most fiercely in the aftermath. Villagers avoided the ruins, claiming that silence lingered there like smoke. Travelers reported that no birds nested in the old palace walls, and that when the wind passed through the halls it carried no sound, only a hollow hush. Priests warned against speaking the boy's name, insisting it could summon famine anew. Some went further, claiming he had never been human at all, but an avatar of silence itself, sent to remind men that power and words are fragile, and that only silence endures. Against these claims, skeptics mounted their defenses. They argued that silence was only memory exaggerated by trauma. Witnesses of sudden death often recall the world freezing in that instant, the absence of sound, the distortion of time. What villagers called curse was nothing more than psychology, what priests called divine punishment was coincidence, and what legends called supernatural was simply the natural magnified through fear. Yet even skeptics could not fully dismiss the knees. For why did the boy's story survive when so many others vanished into the dust of archives? Why did scribes record his silence with such intensity, as though the absence of voice mattered more than the king's crown? Was it because silence unsettles us more deeply than speech, that we fear what is withheld more than what is confessed? In this sense, the boy's muteness became more than a condition. It became a symbol, a screen onto which centuries projected their dread of the unsayable. Science and superstition thus formed twin mirrors in which we see the boy, but never his face clearly. One shows him as scapegoat, trapped by contaminated water and political intrigue. The other reveals him as omen, ritual, curse. Both reflect truths, yet both distort. Perhaps he was simply a child caught in forces larger than himself, poverty, famine, dynastic struggle, or perhaps, as the villagers whispered, he was chosen from birth, tongue silenced by God or devil to serve as executioner at history's feast. The tragedy is that we will never know. Soil tests and chronicles, theology and psychology, all circle the silence without ever piercing it. The boy himself left no words, no confession, no defense, only silence. And it is that silence, more than arsenic or prophecy, that endures. For silence cannot be disproven, cannot be explained away. It resists science, it feeds superstition, it becomes both weapon and refuge. And so the debate rages on. Was the king's death the natural end of a poisoned body, betrayed by the very land that sustained him? Or was it the inevitable curse of a mute servant whose silence was heavier than any word, deadlier than any toxin? Some believe we will find the answer in soil and bone, in chemical traces and archaeological layers. Others insist the truth lies beyond proof, in the realm where myth takes root because reason cannot. In the end, the cupbearer remains untouchable, sealed in the stillness of history. Science circles him with evidence, superstition crowns him with fear, but both fail to shatter the silence that defined him. It is this very silence that ensures his story survives, not as fact, not as myth, but as both at once. A paradox, haunting and unresolved, echoing through the centuries. Perhaps that is why we return to it again and again, because in the boy's silence we see the limits of our own knowledge and the terror of never knowing. History, for all its vastness, often reduces itself to fragments. A letter half burned, a diary entry smudged by time, a testimony buried in margins of chronicles. The banquet that ended a dynasty was no exception. From that night, only shards remain, voices caught between confession and concealment, survivors who lived long enough to leave a trace, yet who seemed to vanish soon after. What lingers from them is not clarity but unease, the sense that each witness carried more than memory. They carried silence itself, a silence that spread like contagion through their words, their families, their descendants. To reconstruct the boy's presence, we must listen to these broken voices and recognize that in their disjointed echoes lies the truest record of that night. The first testimony comes from a guard, anonymous in name yet vivid in his confession. Preserved in a parchment found among the archives of a monastery, he claims to have descended into the palace cellars hours before the feast. There, by the flicker of torchlight, he saw the boy kneeling before what he described as a blackened altar. The words are sparse, almost hesitant, as though the guard could not fully articulate what he had seen. No idols, no cross, only stone, charred as if fire once dwelt there. The boy's hands lay flat, his head bent. He made no sound. Some scholars dismiss this as invention, the product of a mind steeped in superstition. But to others it suggests ritual, the idea that silence was not absence but offering. If true, the boy's muteness was not affliction but vow, and the cup he bore upstairs was not wine but sacrament. A second account appears in the margins of a courtier's diary, its ink faded, words barely legible. The courtier, believed to have been seated at the feast, writes of the taste of his own wine, a sharpness, metallic, as though the cup had been dipped in iron. He lived to write it, though others fell ill. His testimony has fueled scientific theories of arsenic or mineral poisoning, yet the detail he dwells on most is not the taste, but the silence. When His Majesty raised the goblet, all clamor ceased. No lute played, no servant moved. It was as though breath itself was withheld. His choice of words unsettles more than the idea of poison. It suggests that silence was not remembered afterward, but felt in the moment, thick and tangible, a presence woven into the air, Yet the strangest voices do not come from the night itself, but from the centuries that followed. Descendants of courtiers, families who fled after the dynasty's fall, recorded recurring dreams. In these dreams, the silent boy appeared at their bedside, holding a goblet that overflowed not with wine but with shadow. Some awoke with parched throats, convinced they had swallowed darkness. Others described his eyes, blank, reflective, like mirrors that showed not their faces but the outlines of graves. Historians, wary of dreams, label these stories as inherited trauma. Fear passed through generations, memory transformed into nightmare. But in their consistency lies a puzzle. Families separated by distance, by language, by time, told the same dream. The mute cupbearer offering them a drink they dared not accept. How can coincidence explain such unity of vision? Among these accounts is one that chills above all others. A letter, dated nearly 70 years after the feast, from a nun cloistered far from the ruins, who claimed descent from a maid who once served in the royal kitchens. The nun wrote of visions during prayer, where she saw the boy standing in the doorway of the chapel, goblet in hand, waiting. He does not move, he does not speak, yet all prayers falter when he appears, she confessed to her abbess. The abbess dismissed it as temptation, a trick of the devil, but the nun insisted otherwise. It is not temptation. It is remembrance. He waits for us all. What lingers in this testimony is the notion that the boy's silence did not end with the king, but pursued those who bore witness, haunting their descendants with quiet insistence. Historians have long puzzled at the disappearance of so many survivors from records. The guard, the courtier, even musicians said to have played that night. Most vanish after a few years, their names absent from rolls and ledgers. Did they die in obscurity, shamed by association? Were they silenced, their accounts too dangerous to preserve? Or did they carry a secret too heavy for survival, one that erased them not by blade or rope but by erasure itself? Some argue this is simply the collapse of an unstable kingdom, the scattering of records in times of famine and rebellion. Yet others detect deliberate removal, as though someone, perhaps the church, perhaps the new rulers, wished to smother their voices. But even when erased, silence itself testifies. In their vanishing lies a trace as powerful as words. Psychologists read these accounts with careful detachment. They see trauma shaping memory, silence becoming symbol. The metallic taste may have been suggestion, the altar an imagined fear, the dream's expressions of generational guilt. In times of upheaval, the mind reconfigures chaos into narrative, transforming what it cannot bear into images of ritual and curse. Survivors, unable to reconcile what they witnessed, clothed their experience in the only language they could: myth. The silent boy became their vessel, carrying what they could not voice. Through him they explained the inexplicable, bore the unbearable. But religious interpreters push back, pointing to the moral weight of these testimonies. To them, the consistency of silence described is no accident of psychology. It is warning. Scripture itself speaks of silence as divine instrument, silence before destruction, silence before revelation. The survivors did not hallucinate. They bore witness to judgment. Their muteness afterward, their vanishing from record, reflects not accident but consequence. They had looked upon what men were not meant to see, and just as the boy's silence sealed the king's fate, their silence sealed theirs. One particularly haunting account survives in song, an anonymous ballad sung in the villages for generations after. Its verses, though altered by time, speak of a shadow cup and a child who smiles without tongue. Folk songs rarely preserve history with precision, but they preserve atmosphere, emotional truth. This ballad, sung in whispers by firesides, suggests that the survivors' memories did not remain confined to letters and diaries. They seeped into culture, into lullabies, into the very rhythm of rural life. Each performance was not mere entertainment, but an act of remembering, and perhaps of fearing that silence might return. When placed side by side, the survivors' accounts form a tapestry both fragmented and unnerving. A guard glimpsing ritual in a cellar, a courtier tasting iron in his wine, descendants dreaming of shadow-filled goblets, a nun confessing visions that stilled her prayers, villagers singing songs of a mute child whose smile outlived a king. Each piece contradicts the others, yet together they form a pattern. And at the center of that pattern is not poison, not politics, not famine, but silence. Silence remembered, silence dreamt, silence sung. The parallels with the boy himself are unavoidable. Just as he spoke no words, the survivors left only broken testimonies, voices trailing into nothing. Their accounts, though vivid, never yield resolution. They offer flashes of imagery, cinematic yet incomplete, like fragments of a dream that fade upon waking. In this, the survivors mirror the boy. They become silent themselves, their voices extinguished by shame, fear, or forces beyond comprehension. What they leave us is no answers but echoes, faint and haunting. And perhaps that is the point, for the survivors' silence is not failure of testimony, but extension of the ritual. The banquet did not end with the king's death. It continued in the quiet that spread through those who lived, in the muteness that swallowed their words, in the dreams that stalked their children. The boy poured not only wine but silence, and each who drank or even watched carried that silence with them. Science can analyze metallic tastes, psychology can interpret trauma, theology can proclaim judgment, but none can explain why silence itself is the most consistent thread across centuries. Survivors did not agree on poison or altar or shadow. They agreed only on silence, the stillness that fell when the goblet touched royal lips. And that silence, more than poison, more than politics, has endured. The banquet ended in silence, but silence, as history teaches, is never final. From it grows speculation, fear, and the restless work of human imagination. Over centuries, the mute boy who once poured a goblet in a fading court ceased to be a footnote in a chronicle and became something larger, darker, an archetype. Theories multiplied, each one claiming to explain what words, facts, and soil could not. And as time moved forward, what was once a chilled at the king's table transformed into a mirror, reflecting not just the fears of a single court, but the anxieties of entire generations. The most rational of theories begins with espionage. In the violent politics of 15th century Europe, poisoning was hardly unheard of. A nameless servant, mute and unnoticed, would make the perfect assassin. Some argue the boy was trained perhaps by enemies of the king, his silence not accident but discipline. Without words, he betrayed no secrets. Without a voice, he could never confess. His role as cupbearer placed him at the very threshold of life and death, his hand controlling what entered the king's body. To these theorists, the boy was no omen or curse, but a weapon, shaped by human cunning, unleashed at the perfect moment. And yet the flaw in this theory is obvious. Why, if trained, did he not vanish after the deed? Why do records hint at his survival, at his haunting presence after the king's fall? An assassin's purpose ends with this strike. The boy's story did not. Others, less pragmatic but no less compelling, see in him the outline of a cultist. Whispers tell of hidden sects that lingered in the hills and forests, remnants of faiths older than the church, darker than scripture. To them, silence was sacrament, goblets vessels of offering. A boy raised in such a tradition would not see his role as service but as ritual. The pouring of wine for a dying king becomes more than refreshment. It becomes sacrifice, binding power and death in one gesture. Scholars who entertain this theory point to the guard's testimony of a blackened altar in the cellars, to the dreams of descendants who saw goblets filled with shadow. These details, dismissed as fear or hallucination, take on sharper meaning if read as fragments of ritual. The boy was not mute by nature but silenced by vow. He was not servant but priest, officiating at the funeral of a kingdom. Folklore, as always, expanded the canvas further than fact would allow. Villagers spoke of wells that swallowed souls, claiming the boy had been seen near such places, pouring shadow into water. Travelers swore they glimpsed his outline at dusk, centuries later, standing at crossroads or ruins, goblet in hand, as though still offering a drink no one dared accept. These tales blur history and haunting, suggesting the boy never died but lingers, a revenant bound not to flesh but to ritual itself. Rational minds scoff at such legends, yet they endure, passed from mouth to mouth as warnings. Parents hush their children with thestery. If you ever see the silent servant, do not take what he offers. The myth becomes cautionary, a way of keeping fear alive, of making silence itself into something deadly. Philosophers entered the debate, moving it from folklore to morality. To them, the boy was neither assassin nor priest but a mirror. His silence reflected the corruption of the court, the rot that gnawed at its foundations. The king, surrounded by flatterers and liars, trusted only the mute child, and in doing so sealed his fate. The cupbearer was innocence twisted into instrument, purity made into poison. Was he evil, or was he merely the last honest servant in a hall full of deceit, delivering death because no one else dared? Some philosophers frame him as judge, not executioner, his silence exposing the sins of those around him, his final act a verdict on a kingdom already doomed. In this view, the boy's haunting lies not in his mystery, but in his clarity. He reminds us that courts and empires collapse not by accident, but by their own corruption. And sometimes the smallest hand delivers the final blow. Psychologists see another pattern. The persistence of archetypes. The silent servant, the poisoned chalice, the doomed banquet. These are motifs that recur across cultures. From Greek tragedy to medieval ballads, the motif of a drink offered, of silence masking doom, threads through human imagination. To them, the boy's story may have begun with a real death, but what gave it endurance was myth. The trauma of survivors reshaped into images that fight tangent templates. The mute child became a vessel, carrying not only the king's last sip but the weight of centuries of storytelling. In this view, the boy never truly existed as we imagine him. He is an amalgam, a construction of archetype and memory, shaped less by who he was than by what he symbolized. The danger of trust, the terror of silence, the inevitability of betrayal. Yet believers resist this reduction. To them, myth does not erase truth but reveals it. Every legend begins with a seed, and seeds grow only if rooted in something real. Their recurring dreams, the consistency of silence described by witnesses, the folkloric echoes across centuries, all point, they argue, to a reality beyond psychology. The boy was not invented but preserved, his presence too disturbing to vanish. That he haunts both record and imagination is not evidence of archetype, but of endurance. Evil, they claim, leaves echoes. The boy is one such echo, still pouring silence into history. And so theories divide but never converge. Was he an assassin wielding poison, a cultist conducting ritual, a revenant haunting crossroads, a mirror reflecting corruption, or an archetype birthed by human fear? Each explanation illuminates a piece, yet none completes the picture. The boy remains liminal, caught between categories: victim and executioner, history and legend, silence and speech. His power lies not in what is known, but in what resists knowing. What unsettles most is the recognition that every theory, whether rational or mystical, ends in the same place: silence. The assassin theory cannot explain why he lingered. The cultist theory cannot prove ritual existed. Folklore cannot be verified. Philosophy offers questions, not answers. Psychology dissolves him into symbol. Belief leaves him suspended in shadow. And through it all, the boy never speaks. His silence endures, resisting every attempt to pin it down. Perhaps that is why his story persists. Theories, myths, philosophies, they are not attempts to explain him but to break his silence. And each failure proves the same truth. Silence cannot be broken by words. It swallows them. That is why he haunts. That is why, even now, centuries later, we tell history not to resolve it but to dwell within its absence. The boy who poured the final cup left no explanation, no confession, no defense. And so, we are left to pour our own words into the goblet, to taste what silence makes of them. The banquet ended in silence, the kind that does not fade but settles like dust, clinging to walls and memory alike. The king was lowered into the earth, his tomb sealed with stone and scripture. Yet the true weight of that night remained unburied. What history could not preserve in ink was carried forward in whispers. The boy, mute and unyielding, who poured the final cup. No grave records his body, no confession marks his guilt, no testimony grants him the dignity of an ending. He vanishes from the chronicles as if the earth itself refused to speak his name. Only silence remains, stretching across centuries like a shadow. For historians, the boy is a footnote, an emblem of paranoia at the twilight of a fractured kingdom. Their pens reduce him to an artifact of hysteria, a symbol of a dying monarch's court desperate to assign blame. Psychologists shape him into a figure of archetype, the voiceless child pressed into service, transformed into an instrument of dread by the very society that should have sheltered him. To them, his silence is not curse but trauma, an emptiness that others filled with meaning because they could not bear to face their own. Religious interpreters disagree, warning that such dismissal blinds us to the possibility that silence can itself be sacred. They whisper that his muteness was not absence but presence, that he carried within him a weight not of this world, an echo older than throne or scripture. Was he pawn executioner or something beyond either? Some claim he was a child orphaned by famine and swept into court politics, a fragile vessel caught in storms larger than himself. Others paint him as a trained assassin, sharpened into silence by enemy hands, his role preordained the moment he set foot in the hall. And then there are those who step beyond human explanation altogether, suggesting he was not boy but embodiment, the incarnation of silence itself. To them, the goblet was no chalice but a ritual object, and the act of pouring was not service but proclamation, a warning that power need not shout to destroy. The unsettling truth is that none of these theories resolve his mystery. Each lens, historical, psychological, theological, casts light, but the shadows remain. His silence is stronger than explanation. consuming words as surely as the goblet consumed wine. That is why he endures. Not because he was understood, but because he was not. And so the story closes as it began, without resolution. The cup was drained, the kingdom fell, and the boy walked into shadow. In every telling he escapes definition, slipping past fact and into something deeper, more primal. To this day the question lingers in the silence he left behind. Was he merely human? Or something else entirely?